let's get into the psychology. I think now this is where maybe you and I disagree a little bit when I was reading through your book. I think Kamala has nothing, no agenda. I don't think she personally has an agenda other than to be president. I think she just would be thrilled. I'm president. Wow. I don't I don't know if she's has any sort of ideology, any sort of stances. And the reason I think that is because when I watched her through the 2020 primary cycle, she again would flip flop every single viewpoint she put out there. She flip flopped. It was like she was waiting to be told what to say. So I don't think she has any other agenda other than wanting to be in a position of power, wanting that fame, wanting that title, that the achievement of having the title would be enough for her. And then she would let all of the people behind her just pull the puppet strings. She just wants to be the person with the glory in front. And I think that makes her very dangerous, extremely dangerous, because a puppet is dangerous. Who's really the person behind them when we can't see them in this shadowy government making all of the real decisions while they've got this, person that they're just parading around. But you differ on that. You actually think that she is angry, that she's got hatred, anger built up inside of her. And this has to do with, interestingly, it sounded to me, and I don't necessarily disagree with you on this, but it sounded to me like you were blaming the lack of fatherhood for a lot of these political figures. Like you're saying, these people didn't have dads. Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Kamala Harris, they didn't have dads in their lives. And because of it, they had it brings out a certain part of a person. Am I interpreting that wrong?
I think, yeah, that's not exactly the point I was making. I think the important thing, and I talk about this, I open the second chapter by talking about our recent US presidents and how you'll notice that they all have an oddly similar life story. That there's certain overlap in their life stories. For example, Barack Obama and Bill Clinton. Both of them didn't really know their fathers, were raised by their mothers. Their mothers married men who abused them, stepfathers who abused them. They left the stepfathers, and they stayed with their son. And their son was with them from, without a father to the stepfather leaving, staying with them. Both of them learned at a young age that they were quite charismatic and good at giving speeches. Both of them had mothers who really wanted them to be big achievers and push them forward in life. And they both ended up at Ivy League schools, and they ended up being president of the United States. And their charm was similar. Barack Obama reminded people of the civil rights movement, and he was able to kind of charm people not with what he actually said, but with his tone. His tone seemed very inspiring, and almost like we were in the middle of the civil rights movement. We were there with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And Bill Clinton was a similar thing. Bill Clinton, well, his words were not that radical, but he reminded us all of Southern populism and fighting for the working man and all that. That was not what he was doing. And Donald Trump and the former president George W. Bush also have a similar life story. Both of them had a very high achieving father, right? I mean, George Herbert Walker Bush, president of the United States, former CIA director. Donald Trump, Fred Trump, his father was a quite high achieving real estate businessman in New York City. And both of them, from a young age, were viewed as the screw up son of a high achieving father. You'll remember everyone thought Jeb Bush might be presidential material, but George W. Bush was an alcoholic. George W.
Mhm.
Bush was arrested at a football game for rowdy behavior. George W. Bush had an issue with cocaine. George W. Bush, started a baseball team that flopped, and everyone saw George W. Bush as a party boy, as the screw up son. And so George W. Bush had something to prove. And Donald Trump is a similar story. He was sent to military boarding school. He was the bad boy in the Trump family, and so he went into adulthood with something to prove. And that became clear as he was very much trying to make a name for himself, being very flashy and in the media, et cetera. And that the psychology of you and me doesn't really matter that much, but the psychology of who's the president of the United States is very important, right? Because
Mhm.
Barack Obama didn't want to go into Libya, and they convinced him to go into Libya. And we now know from the memoir of Ben Rhodes and others how they convinced Barack Obama to send the cruise missiles to destroy Libya. And they worked on him for 3 days. And they told him that, Benghazi, this city, Gaddafi says when he retakes it, he's going to go house to house. And they told Barack Obama that meant he's going to kill everyone there. He's going to commit genocide. That's not what Gaddafi meant. He meant he was going to find who the terrorists were. But they told him he's going to go house to house. He's going to kill everyone in Benghazi. And you're going to be remembered, Barack, as the president who didn't stop a genocide, and you could have helped these people and you didn't. And they worked on him for 3 days, and finally he gave in and he sent the cruise missiles in. And it was very important to know Barack Obama's psychology, to know that Barack Obama had seen his mother being domestically abused and beaten by his stepfather and couldn't do anything about it, and that he very much had his own damage and his own issues, and that was key in getting him to do what they wanted. And so that's why looking into the background of Kamala Harris is interesting, because Kamala Harris invokes her own childhood more than any other politician I have ever seen. We all know the catchphrase, "That little girl was me." T-shirts with 10-year-old Kamala Harris on them. And often when she does things that are a little more repugnant, she invokes her own childhood, right? There's a clip
Yeah,
of
she
her
even did
talking.
that recently about her laugh. Have you seen that trending just today? It's been
I did
trending
not.
that, yeah, just today they did exactly what you're talking about, where they say that people have been getting on her case about her laugh. Now I get on her case about her laugh because I think she laughs at the most inappropriate times. It's not her laugh itself; it's just that she's constantly giggling when she shouldn't be, right? So she sits down in an interview, and you know what she says? She says, "You know, my laugh. I have my mother's laugh." This is what she says. When I was a little girl, I would sit there and listen to my mom with her friends, and they would come over and they would talk about things and they would laugh about life, and they had big laughs, and I have a big laugh. I'm not going to sit there quietly when I grew up, you know. So she's doing it. She did literally today exactly what you're talking about. She invokes the young little girl Kamala and her life experiences growing up, and that's why her laugh is the way her laugh is.
Right. And I mean, Kamala Harris is well over 50 years old, but she's invoking her childhood endlessly. She's talking about "that little girl was me." She's talking about experiences with racism that she had. She's talking about being bused. She's talking about all kinds of things. And, you know, there's that clip of her talking about how she jailed parents, or prosecuted parents at least, for truancy. And
Yeah.
that was her big policy. And many people said that's, you know, it's certainly a problem if kids are being neglected and not getting to school, or you know, it's got to be dealt with. But it doesn't help low income, you know, children to have their parents thrown in jail, to have them put
Right.
in the foster, you know, system while their parents are doing time, you know. And so for Kamala to do that, but she justifies it. She says, "Well, I wouldn't be anywhere in life if it wasn't for my education." It's about her. Well, it's not supposed to be about her.
Hmm.
It's supposed to be about enforcing the law. But the fact that she invokes her own childhood so endlessly, and that, kind of like what you just talked about with today, with this anecdote about, you know, people made fun of her for her laugh or whatever, she sees herself as a victim. And in her narrative, it's very clear her mother is a saint. Her mother can do no wrong. Her mother is all things good. And her father, she does not want to talk about. Donald Harris, who is still living, unlike her mother, who lives in Jamaica, who has denounced her presidential campaign and denounced her during the 2020 election after she invoked her Jamaican heritage. She doesn't want to talk about her father at all, and the two of them are not on good speaking terms. And that is very, very clear. And what's weird is, if you look into the details, there was an ugly divorce. In Kamala Harris's autobiography, she says that the only thing her parents fought over when they divorced was the books. Well, that sounds nice. They only fought over the books. Well, Donald Harris, in his Reflections of a Jamaican Father, tells a very different story. And he says they didn't just fight over the books, they fought over Kamala and her sister. There was a custody battle. And in that custody battle, they played up the stereotype of Jamaican men and black men in general as being, you know, pot smoking, lazy joy seekers. And that's why when Kamala Harris said, when she was on the Breakfast Club, a radio show, they asked her if she'd ever smoked weed. And she said, "Half my family's from Jamaica. What do you think?" That really rubbed Donald Harris the wrong way, because that stereotype was used to prevent him from being able to raise his daughter. He's a PhD. He's a well-respected academic economist who taught at Stanford. But the
Hmm.
courts, in his view, saw him as a black man from the Caribbean, as potentially not a good father. And he was not able to raise his daughters because of that stereotype. And so he heard those words, and he immediately went to the media, and he said that his entire Jamaican family wants to distance themselves from what he called a travesty of identity politics. Those are intense words. I mean, you know, I mean, if you don't think Kamala has some intense baggage, you're wrong. But the other thing that's important to keep in mind, and this is why what I said before about the previous presidents is important. This story is all over the Hillary Clinton State Department wing of American politics. And that's what is so weird, right? Samantha Power, right? She was Barack Obama's United Nations ambassador. She was a main crafter of the policies of the Hillary Clinton State Department. Samantha Power, she grew up in Ireland, and her father was an alcoholic who beat her mother. And her father, and mother separated. She came to the United States with her mother. Her father died of alcohol poisoning. And she has grown up in the world, and her goal is to overthrow powerful tyrants around the world, right? Her career basically started pushing U.S. military intervention in former Yugoslavia, demonizing Milosevic, saying we have to move in and overthrow this authoritarian strongman. She was the main author of the U.S. military intervention in Libya, and she has spent her life building the case for war and revenge, and she has the same baggage that Kamala has. Amy Klobuchar, very similar story. Again, father was an alcoholic, beat up her mother. There was a divorce. She didn't speak to her father until he, started, stopped drinking in the 20s and was able to, when she was in her 20s, and she kind of forgave him. But she became, just like Kamala Harris, a very vicious prosecutor. And Amy Klobuchar, her trademark when she was a prosecutor was what they called gang experts, which was that, there'd be a black man who was on trial for some crime, and they would hire an expert witness who knew nothing about the case, but would just get up on the witness stand and scare the crap out of jurors by telling them horror stories about awful things that gangs do, no direct bearing on the man on trial. And these juries would hear these horror stories about what gangs do and be, oh my God, we can't acquit this guy because what if he gets out? He might do one of these awful things, and they would convict these people. That was Amy Klobuchar's trademark. And in the 1990s, as mass incarceration, the prison rate in California and other parts of the country was rising, Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar are making their careers, throwing black men in jail, scaring juries, psyching people up. There is a real desire to harm other people. There is a real desire for vengeance. Samantha Power creates her career by justifying U.S. bombs and military interventions against countries that happen to be led by powerful men who are portrayed as dictators and stuff. You can see there is a psychological component to this. And when we look at this, it seems very apparent that there are people around Kamala Harris who know how to push her buttons. They know what they can say to her, and that Kamala Harris views herself as a victim. We don't know all the details, okay? Donald Harris left us some hints in his essay. It's very carefully written. If you read it, he talks about how sad he is that she never met her grandmother, how her grandmother is kind of who was a member of parliament in Jamaica and was a socialist and a labor representative. And there's some hints there. He doesn't exactly say what the story is. But for some reason, she feels that she is a victim. She feels the world has been unfair to her, and she blames Donald Harris for that. We don't know exactly why, and I speculate. I mean, there's various reasons why. The other thing, and this is a big blank spot in all narratives of Kamala Harris, is that her high school years were spent not in California, but in Quebec. And she never talks about what went on in Quebec. Now, I've heard rumors that I'm not going to repeat because I don't know, I have no way of substantiating them. But a lot of people have said that something very awful happened to Kamala Harris when she was a high school student in Quebec. I can't confirm that, but I do know that in all her autobiographies and all of her references to her life, there's this huge blank spot for when she lived in Canada for a few years. And that's, those were pretty important years in her life. She never talks about them. And Kamala Harris views herself as a victim, and she's angry, and she wants vengeance. And that's what made it okay in her mind to do the awful things she did as California State Attorney General. That little girl was me. The world was unfair to me, and I can do what I want. I need to show that I'm powerful. I need to show that I mean, it's awful. It's awful. The more you look into it, I do think there's awful.
Yeah, so daddy issues sounds like, I mean, you're pointing this out with like Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar, right? There's certainly something there. In my experience, the people who have quote unquote daddy issues have a deep-seated insecurity that causes them to seek approval and to do things, especially of more powerful men who they perceive to be more powerful men. So if you're a male with daddy issues, you would seek out men that you think are more powerful than you, and you would seek out their approval. Women, we see women all the time with daddy issues. I think that's more people are more familiar with women with daddy issues. And what do? They seek out the attention and the approval of men, sometimes way too many men, or they have a slew of terrible relationships with abusive men, or they kind of relive that out over and over. I've experienced the daddy issues with men and with women, and I see the same things. Now, I don't have those issues. I was raised by my dad. I have a very close relationship with my dad. I talk to him every day. So I can see the difference. I also grew up in a broken home. I didn't have my mom around really, but my dad was my constant parent, which was very odd. Most people, their mother raises them and their dad is not in the picture. And for me, it was opposite. My mom, I saw on occasion, and I was with my dad full time from the time I was really little. So I and I have, interestingly, numerous friends. It's like almost like I've attracted them into my life who've also been raised by their fathers, other women whose mothers were not around, and they were too raised by their dad. Most of my good friends have that same story somehow, some way. It's like it's like that you attract each other, right? Naturally. And it's a real stark difference in my mind. I've dated men who've not had their fathers around. I could not understand them. There was no, and it was this constant, in my view. Now, this is just my opinion. I'm sure a psychologist could break this down a lot better. But in my view, there was a deep sense of insecurity and a deep need for approval that left an instability there. And to me, it makes sense then, if these powerful people, if these people who have these issues continue to rise up into these positions of power, when the powerful apparatus wants to be able to control that person. So if the establishment, the deep state or whatever, wants a puppet, well, then you get somebody with daddy issues who's looking to just please you. They just want to, oh, anything you need me to do, I will. What is it that I need to do in order to be liked, in order to be approved of, in order to be pleasing to you? I will do that, versus somebody who's had a very stable family home. And even more so, I mean, I've always, because of my personal experiences and talk and seeing women who've not had their fathers around and men who have not had their fathers around, being with people like my husband, who has, his parents are still married after 40 something years together, seeing all those differences. I personally, and I've said this, I don't really talk about it publicly as much on this show just because it's, not really the topic, but I've always said, I do think that the world got it a bit wrong. I think fathers are actually more important than mothers. They're both very important. But there's something about what a father brings to the child, a sense of security, a sense of self-worth, that without that, you see entire populations, unfortunately, even this country, run amok. Right? They demand, when their fathers are ripped from them, incarcerated, they're not around. You see how that creates a sense of insecurity and instability within even a community. So I think fathers are incredibly important, and I even argue even more important than mothers. I think mothers bring an enormous amount of wonderful things to their children, but the sense of self and security, I think, comes from a father. And so if you can find leaders that don't have that, I mean, just imagine all the manipulation you could do. And it's interesting that you point out that every single one of them doesn't have that relationship. I mean, what are the chances in this country? What are the I mean, I know we have a lot of divorce, but we also have a lot of we have a lot of people who never, my grandparents on my dad's side never divorced. I grew up at my grandparents. I was there a lot. My dad raised me, but of course he was a single guy trying to raise a little girl. And so he took me to my grandparents' house every day. I was there seeing my grandmother and grandfather married till the day they died. There's enough of that. There's enough people in this country who have homes, intact homes, who have good fathers. Why is it that these leaders continue to have that same story over and over and over again? Isn't that odd?
Well, I've heard it said before that in intelligence circles, one is considered an asset, not if they're hired by the intelligence agency, not if the intelligence agency can give them orders and tell them what to do, but rather when the intelligence agencies can predict their behavior in any given circumstance.
Yeah.
And what we need right now, especially with certain current global situations, with Ukraine, with the island of Taiwan and the Korean Peninsula and everything, we need someone who is clear-headed, somebody who can look at situations and make very careful, calculated decisions. But it seems like our American political system and the way that the deep state and the people who actually run things operate is they seek out people that are very unstable, very, very loose cannons, people that they know exactly how to push their buttons, and they get them into positions because they know they can get them to do what they want. And that is
Yeah.
very, very frightening. And there's a word that I've often referenced that I think you can very well see in the leadership that they have in China right now or the leadership in Russia. That word is statecraft, right? That governance, responsible governance is very much an art. It's not something that you want just an actor to do. It's not somebody you want,
Mhm.
somebody you can just have a beer with and hang out with. Statecraft, the science of governance is a very, important, crafted skill. And it goes back over the years. And if you look at the very effective leaders that we have around the world today, or the very effective leaders of our country, that we have, these are skilled statesmen or people engaged in the arts of statecraft. Great example, I talk about Roosevelt in the book. Roosevelt was a very brilliant leader, very brilliant in many, many ways. And that Roosevelt was impacted by the fact that he went to a Christian socialist boarding school when he was a young man. His schoolmaster was Endicott Peabody, and Endicott Peabody was a Christian socialist, and he ran this kind of boarding school in New England. And he was one of the closest friends that Roosevelt had. He presided over his wedding. He presided over church services on the day of his inauguration. And that Roosevelt really looked up to this Christian socialist schoolmaster that he had when he was a young man growing up in New England. I talk about Abraham Lincoln and how Abraham Lincoln very much played that role for the country. He was a populist. He was, from the wild, unsettled territory of Illinois. He was a country lawyer who had fought for the downtrodden and fought for low-income people and called out the rich and powerful. And that in a lot of ways, populism is not something to be afraid of. Populism means empowering ordinary people, means bringing ordinary people into politics and enacting an agenda of making life better. And I don't think we should avoid populism. And that this whole concept, we're talking about fathers and mothers and all of this. This is all important because this is what, Sigmund Freud talked about, the concept of transference, right? And that when you are a child, your relationship with your parents is the most important relationship in your life. And throughout life, you will transfer that relationship into how you see other people. And there's no way to avoid that. That just happens. Right. And that unfortunately, it is damage in the early years of life and in one's relationship with one's parents that can put people into a bad spot.
Hey guys, this was just a clip of a longer show. Catch the full show by going to KimIversonShow.com. It is free. It airs Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. You could go back now and watch this full interview. I highly recommend it. Again, go to KimIversonShow.com. Thank you so much for watching.